So you finished studying and thinking about Act 3 of Measure for Measure. Now's the time to look very carefully about how this wonderful act is presented within multiple interpretations and productions. So within this video I'm going to give you screenshots from movies stroke stage productions from 1979, 2004, 2006 and an RSC gem from 2019. I'm going to show you how you can integrate references to these productions into your essay to help you get that A star at A level. So stay tuned because you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare. As usual, I'm going to kick off with Desmond Davis's 1979 BBC production of Measure for Measure. One of the striking features of Act 3 is the way Isabella turns on her brother in Act 3, Scene 1, following his suggestion that she might just give in to Angelo's demands in order to save his life. And for phrases such as die, perish, and I'll pray 1,000 prayers for thy death to be most effective and dramatic, we need to be convinced that prior to all of this, the two had a close relationship and genuinely cared about each other. In this production, the closeness is evident in the intense, loving way the two embrace each other and keep their hands on each other's shoulders throughout Isabella's temporarily relieved comments about Claudio's nobility and fitness to be their father's son. Yet, to diverge slightly, it's worth decoding exactly what Isabella is saying here, and particularly how she is saying it, whilst in this production she has her arms on her brother's shoulders. The first two lines could be spoken by virtually anyone in the play. It is agreed that Angelo appears saintly on the outside, likes to look stern, and to choose his words carefully and pompously. However, could the final four lines only be spoken by Isabella? She suggests that his ways of operating are akin to the savage way a falcon rips into the back of a fowl's neck in order to paralyze it. Does Isabella really need to use such gruesome imagery? Given her brother's plight, is this sensitive or helpful? Or is Isabella just someone for whom there is an enormous contrast and conflict between professed desires for religious, asexual solitude and her repressed, charged, often disturbing language? Her imagery is also interesting here, as it both seems to suggest she disapproves of the natural urges of the young being so ruthlessly punished, but also indirectly reminds Claudio that his own head is highly likely to be chopped off in the very near future. As ever with so many characters in Measure for Measure, most notably the Duke, it is difficult to make our minds up about exactly what kind of a person Isabella is. Other notable moments from the Isabella and Claudio exchange of Act 3, Scene 1 include a close-up to show Claudio's genuine shock at the suggestion that his sister could be pressurized to give up her chastity to Angelo. Like everyone else, he clearly thought that the outward sainted deputy, in the words of Lucio, was spawned by a sea maid, i.e. he was cold and utterly disinterested sexually. At this point in the dialogue, he is in tune with Isabella and completing her lines. It is also worth noting that Claudio cannot bring himself to look at Isabella when starting the process by which he will ask her to go through with Angelo's proposition in order to save his life. He talks of his fears of what could happen to him on his death, and the transition from living warm life into netted clod, a mere inanimate lump of clay. His imagination begins to run wild, and he visualizes the haunting extremes of temperature and torturous weather in hell. In this production, Claudio looking away seems to imply that part of him feels ashamed of what he is saying. He dare not meet her gaze, knowing as he does just how seriously she takes her religious beliefs and just how appalled she would be by any suggestion of immoral, sacrilegious self-sacrifice. His looking away in this production confirms just how desperate he has become. He knows that he has no chance of convincing his sister, but cannot stop himself from trying and sharing his inner terror. In Act 3, Scene 2, I'm always interested and rather shocked by the way Lucio seems so callous when turning down Pompey's request for support and bail. Lucio seems to relish Pompey's humiliation and seems intent on adding to it, hence his satirical references to Caesar and being led in triumph. In this production, Lucio slows down and sounds sonorous when he gets to the lines putting the hands in the pocket before bending down and grabbing Pompey's balls from behind, resulting in the latter crying out in pain and indignation. The reference to Pygmalion's images implies prostitutes. Pygmalion was an ancient sculptor, and in Shakespeare's society, statues were often painted, in the same way that prostitutes would use an excessive amount of makeup. So Lucio is asking whether Pompey's arrest means that prostitutes can no longer be procured for money. And in this production, the director plays on the fact that both money and balls can be touched from within a trouser pocket to humiliate Pompey further. Lucio's presumably newfound open disdain for Pompey is also seen when the latter exits the stage, struggling with elbow. After instructing his former ally to go to kennel, Lucio throws an apple in his direction, which, according to the subtitles, goes splat. Now time for an exam question. To what extent do we feel that the women in the play are dominated by the men? When considering some of Isabella's extraordinary exchanges with both Angelo and Claudio, it is difficult to agree wholeheartedly with the statement that the women in the play are consistently dominated by the men. In Act 3, Scene 1, at least in conversation with her brother, Isabella's control seems absolute. She doesn't simply criticize her brother for suggesting that she might be prepared to sleep with Angelo to save his life. She savages him in spectacular fashion through her suggestions that he might want her to commit a kind of incest and that it would have been better for him to have been born illegitimately. Indeed, in the 1979 BBC production, Claudio dare not even look at Isabella when talking about his fears of death, which will lead on to his request for her to sleep with Angelo. With Isabella looking piercingly in his direction, he clutches the prison bars and dare not turn around to see her reaction. That said, although Isabella may consistently dominate Claudio, the Duke consistently dominates all apart from Barnardine. And in the same scene, he successfully manipulates Isabella, presumably because she sees and trusts him as a friar, into accepting a morally dubious plan in which another woman will sleep with Angelo in her place. Next, on to the 2004 production filmed at the Globe and broadcast live on BBC 4. I find Mark Rylance's portrayal of the Duke slightly unconvincing and, dare I say it, self-indulgent. As a friar, he comes across as a shambling, rather inconsequential figure, someone who, you may recall, was overrun by a forceful Juliet in Act 2, Scene 3. Here in Act 3, Scene 1, he delivers his opening nihilistic monologue quickly and in a rambling monotone, with no pauses for full stops or semicolons, and no points given particular emphasis. At the Globe, the audience burst spontaneously into applause, following the Duke's deliberate pause after the first half of the quasi-philosophical question about the value of life. What's yet in this? But what are they applauding at? They are applauding the actor's ability to deliver serious, depressing lines so rapidly. They are applauding his ability to bamboozle, in spite of coming across as a figure of apparently little gravitas and authority, as a friar at least. It's difficult to know what to make of this Duke and what his motives are in this scene and in this production. He seems to be speaking off-pat rather than with conviction, which is perhaps just as well when his lines are pointing to the fact that Claudio, a father-to-be, remember, has absolutely nothing to live for. In an interview for Theatre Voice back in 2004, Rylance gave an insight into his views of the Duke, or at least when he is disguised as a friar.
And so the three friars in the plays, in a certain way, represent three Samaritans in Shakespeare's conception, and the whole season has something to do with the something to share with the effective and ineffective ways of advising or counseling young people who have these very fateful situations.
So under this interpretation, the Duke Comfrey is motivated by the desire to do good, to help. It isn't just about snooping curiosity and a desire to consolidate power. So perhaps Rylance here has an overview of the Duke Comfrey's motives, which is to prepare Claudio for death, the first victim of a much-needed crackdown on vice. His monotone delivery suggests that, probably, he doesn't personally hold such pessimistic, Jakes-esque views of life, but they are means through which Claudio can be settled down and made at least fatalistic about his death, if not wholly enthusiastic or supportive. Certainly, Rylance's Duke is not a man who likes to be serious or leave the audience feeling too serious for too long. Here the Duke puts a speedy end to Claudio's pleading by bashing him on the head with a heavy-looking book, presumably a Bible, causing laughter from the audience and the mood to be lightened. Given some of the lines that have preceded this, including Isabella's suggestion that she should do everything to ensure Claudio's death goes ahead, including refusing even to bend down, this fun, silly, laugh-inducing head bashing gives us the sense that actually on this stage and in this play, everything is going to be fine in the end. Or, put otherwise, all will be well that ends well. With this shambling Duke Comfrey orchestrating proceedings, this Samaritan figure, in the actor's own words, things may take time, but ultimately they will be sorted out. Another comic moment, when really there shouldn't be one, is seen in Rylance's extended pause after Mariana within the lines shown on screen. The structure of the sentence makes it clear that a past participle will follow, and the extended pause cheekily invites the audience to insert a far dirtier one than that in Shakespeare's text, something along the lines of shagged, for instance. This invitation results in a laugh, and once again the audience is left with the impression that, yes, this plan may be complicated and probably morally problematic, but we are watching a comedy, and we should relax knowing that intricate jumbled pieces will be largely happily resolved by the end of Act 5. What isn't comic, though, is this interesting change made to one of Aeschylus's lines towards the end of Act 3, Scene 2. Rather cleverly, rather than conclude that Angelo sees himself pompously and unhelpfully as the personification of justice, which presumably excludes the possibility of compassion or humanity, Aeschylus's final words describe him as just ice. This alteration continues and extends Lucio's imagery from earlier in the scene. Whereas Lucio suggested that Angelo's urine was congealed ice, in this interpretation, the far more sober, respected Aeschylus has expanded this to encompass the entire man and character. Of course, this change results in a far more explicit criticism from Aeschylus. No longer is it just about Angelo's overly regimented attitude to implementing every single facet of law, irrespective of circumstances, but about him failing to have any natural human warmth whatsoever. Now for the exam question. Is the Duke fantastical and of dark corners? This statement, words spoken by Lucio in Act 4, Scene 3, seems to imply that the Duke likes secret carryings-ons and favours unstraightforward subterfuge, whilst the adjective dark may also point to possible malign intent. After all, if you are the leader and want only the best for your people, why the lack of candour and simplicity? This certainly seems the case in Act 3 of the play, in which the Duke, disguised as a friar, not only directs an extraordinary non-Christian nihilistic tirade at Claudio under the guise of preparing him for death, but also concocts a plan in which a woman who has not been mentioned at all so far in the play will take the place of Isabella within Angelo's lust-driven bed. Some might argue that, at least in relation to the latter, the Duke is simply reacting to unexpected events, which arguably demand an inventive, outside-of-the-box response. And the Duke's plan includes the added benefit of Mariana being advantaged, as well as Isabella's chastity being preserved. However, this argument ignores the fact that the Duke is the Duke, and at any point he can step in and take back control of Vienna from Angelo. The fact that he fails to do so as soon as he hears about Angelo's hypocrisy and corruption does seem to suggest that he gets a kick out of background manoeuvring and has a genuine interest in the effects of power on someone as apparently sober and steadfast as Angelo, if power changed purpose. That said, Mark Rylance, who played the Duke in the 2004 Globe production, was keen to emphasise his character's desire to help the young people who are facing these seemingly insurmountable obstacles to their life, even if on stage his disguised friar frequently seemed shambling and inconsequential, i.e. apparently not capable of helping anyone, perhaps as a ruse. With this interpretation, the statement seems unfair. Perhaps the Duke is determined to do whatever it takes in order to ensure Vienna is returned to civilised, happier, good order. An overall aim which is far from fantastical or dark. Next, back to the 2006 film version of the play, directed by Bob Komar. The early moments of Act 3 in this production accentuate the natural sympathy we feel for Claudio. Why the hell should a man be sentenced to death simply for sleeping with a woman he is effectively already married to? Within the screenshot, you can just about make out a truncheon mid-air in the top left-hand corner, which is about to be brought down upon Claudio, a brutal beating which is clearly making the provost uncomfortable. The evidence of Claudio's brutal treatment in prison is there for all, and Isabella, to see during their exchange in Act 3, Scene 1. Blood seeps from his nose and ear. There is a large purple bruise on his left cheek. As well as heightening the sympathy and compassion we feel for Claudio, these facial wounds are likely to make our minds return to Angelo and the proportionality of his so-called law enforcement. Now Claudio is in prison and by all accounts and purposes is set to die. Is there any real need for Angelo to have him treated so appallingly? This moment from Act 1, Scene 2 sends a public message and thus serves a purpose. Does this? And so the viewers become more likely to gloss over the cocaine sniffing and attempted shagging from the opening of the film and instead wonder about this Angelo-led regime. Indeed, given that the Duke and Friar Thomas seem to develop a genuine bond. In Act 1, Scene 3, they share a light-hearted joke about Angelo when Friar Thomas suggests that the soul of Angelo is his clothes. And here, at the end of Act 3, Scene 2, the Duke's soliloquy about the importance of rulers being honourable and holy at the end of Act 3, Scene 2 is delivered, with him standing closely by a stern-looking Friar Thomas. We are likely to feel strongly that the Duke may be the more principled and caring leader, and the sooner he is back to leave Vienna, the better. Indeed, in this production, he does less slightly disconcerting snooping and sneaking around, less dark corners stuff, if you like. Line 52 from Act 3, Scene 1, in which the Duke asks the provost to bring him to hear Claudio and Isabella speak, is cut, and instead the Duke overhears because he previously telephoned Claudio in the prison to counsel him to be absolute for death, and Claudio left the phone off the hook when Isabella entered. This changes the dynamics. By leaving the phone off the hook deliberately or otherwise, Claudio is implicitly suggesting that he has no objection to the Duke overhearing what is likely to be an intimate, emotionally charged meeting with his sister, and by extension, he trusts him. That said, when Isabella leaves Claudio during an increasingly fraught exchange, and Claudio picks the phone up again to presumably beseech the Most Holy Father for comfort and advice, the Duke looks slightly panic-stricken before hanging up without saying anything. Presumably, as in Shakespeare's original text, his priority is to advise Isabella, who at least has some agency over the future in a way which Claudio does not. The time for Claudio's comfort and salvation will come. Other moments of interest in this production include Isabella slapping Claudio as she points out that his sleeping with Isabella didn't happen by chance but was a habitual practice. something useful perhaps to reference in a question about passivity, lack of agency of women. And the production, as a movie rather than something filmed live on a stage, is also able to show flashbacks of Angelo and Mariana as the Duke explains his extravagant plan, both when they were a happy couple, albeit with Mariana seeming slightly keener on the snog than Angelo, and following Angelo's abandonment. Of course, the effect of these flashbacks is to remove some of the focus away from the Duke and to show categorically that his plan is far from the fanciful, overly convenient lot of nonsense that we might initially conclude in the theatre. Instead, the Duke coming up with this plan immediately paints him as a compassionate, caring, keen for justice person. And that's even before meeting Mariana live in the film. Indeed, the film doesn't just show flashbacks, but also how a successful Mariana Angelo late night liaison worked, with Mariana placing a blindfold over a throbbing Angelo within a silent, darkened room. These flashbacks, successful envisagings, flash forwards, suggest straight away that the Duke has come up with a clever, practical, compassionate plan aimed at resolving a number of complex situations. Indeed, given the emphasis on the tragic loneliness of Mariana, one could even argue that it would be wrong for the Duke to reveal himself to Angelo at this point. Such a revelation might well save Isabella's chastity and Claudio's life, but would arguably do little to improve the lot of a destitute, cruelly abandoned woman. Time for another sample paragraph, this time on the question as to whether this is a play in which power is invariably misused, and I reference the 2006 Komar production. When exploring this question, it is important to point out just how much power the Duke actually has for the majority of the play. Firstly, he is the Duke, a figure with seemingly absolute authority in Vienna, if he can be bothered to use it. Secondly, when disguised as a friar, he can both gain admittance into prisons and elicit personal confessions from all members of society, notwithstanding the fact that at any time he chooses to do so, he can regain his previous ducal authority. He can also use his disguise to find out how his own character of the Duke is viewed, and use this information to consolidate his power later on, something he is particularly determined to do with Lucio. Modern audiences are likely to feel more uncomfortable with the amount of power the Duke has. But does he misuse it? Putting to one side his marriage proposal to Isabella for the moment, it can be argued that his use of power in much of the play is benign and has compassionate aims. His transfer of power to Angelo shows his recognition that Vienna needs to be cleaned up, and there is some humility in his acceptance that his deputy may be able to do this more effectively. 'Twas my fault to give the people scope. Even more pertinently, his plan to save Isabella's chastity is ingenious in that it not only preserves Isabella's virginity, but redresses an old wrong, namely Angelo's abandonment of a woman who truly loved him, following the desperately unlucky loss of her dowry at sea. Komar's 2006 film of the play highlights the Duke's benevolent use of his power and disguise by cutting to flashbacks of a lonely Mariana, including an extreme close-up of her tragic, sad eyes. The greater emphasis on Mariana in this production suggests to the audience that the Duke is not playing around with far-fetched schemes, is not hell-bent on unnecessarily prolonging his own disguise, but is thinking intelligently about how to rectify complex, potentially tragic situations. Now, onto the RSC's 2019 production of the play. I rather like Anthony Burns' portrayal of the Duke, especially in this act. In the opening minutes of Act 3, Scene 1, the Duke has some stunningly depressing, nihilistic lines to deliver, including merely "Thou art death's fool, happy thou art not, friends hast thou none, and thou hast nor youth nor age." Given the crazily bleak nature of his long speech, you would imagine that the primary effect would be to leave Claudio depressed beyond measure, and even more isolated from the warmth of humanity. Yet somehow Anthony Byrne manages to give the impression that he really cares about Claudio whilst delivering the aforementioned miserable lines. How? Well, partly through openly expressing his affection, as seen here in his tender stroking of Claudio's cheek. Partly through close physical proximity, implying a degree of equality of humanity and a desire for companionship. And partly through, and this is crucial, seeming to be speaking as much about himself and the human condition in general as Claudio. Following the lines on screen now, the Duke becomes tearful, and it would seem as though he is reflecting about his own position more than Claudio's. Within this interpretation, we get the impression that the Duke is reflecting on what he himself has to live for. He is significantly older and presumably richer than Claudio, and how older age makes it so much harder to enjoy life, irrespective of status and wealth. So within the RSC 2019 production, the opening moments of Act 3, Scene 1 become somehow a shared expression of human vulnerability, even though the vast majority of lines are spoken by just the Duke, rather than a ruthless deconstruction of Claudio's existence and what he doesn't have to live for. Moving on to Isabella. Certainly pupils I have taught have, on occasion, tried to dismiss her as some kind of psychotic, repressed nutcase. Or at least they have wondered about her, following her use of sadomasochistic imagery when responding to Angelo's demand for the treasures of her body in Act 2, Scene 4, and her suggestion that Claudio's demand for her to save his life is a kind of incest. In this production, she certainly comes across as somewhat repressed and extreme on occasion. I have already referred to her striking spasms whilst being manhandled by Angelo in Act 2, Scene 4. And here you can see her offering Claudio her rosary beads to help him prepare for his death, albeit a sign of devout religious belief rather than extremism perhaps. However, Claudio's expression is telling here, following Isabella's suggestion that a comparison can be made between a brother asking a sister to consider sleeping with a man to save his life and incest. He looks incredulous, and we as the audience increasingly begin to side with him, not necessarily thinking that Isabella should sleep with Angelo, but that she may be slightly unhinged or at least a little odd. Another example of Isabella's extremes, or just her passionate nature, is seen in the way she falls dramatically to the ground, following the Duke's request to speak to her by and by in a conversation which would be to her own benefit. She sobs wildly on the ground, whilst the brief conversation between Claudio and the Duke continues in the background. Note that the film director has chosen to showcase Isabella with this camera angle in a way which is not possible for those in the auditorium, whose ability to see her will depend on the position of their seats. The effect of this is to keep the focus on Isabella in a way which is much harder to do without the availability of multiple different cameras. In the theatre, we would expect to turn our attention more exclusively to Claudio, as the Duke claims that Angelo was only testing her, didn't mean what he said, and so he should prepare himself to die. But here, we cannot take our eyes off Isabella, who moves from crying bitterly to praying fervently. And indeed, she is still deep in prayer, even after the Duke has dismissed Claudio and started to speak. So what should we make of Isabella in this scene and this production? Well, there is no doubt that she is extremely religious and devout, thus making the Duke's marriage proposal in Act 5 seem all the more unpalatable and inappropriate. But more than that, she is so spiritual and otherworldly that she is literally unable to cope with unforeseen, unexpected human interactions. She falls to the ground, she spasms, she prays, and for the majority of the audience, she seems rather pitiful and difficult to engage with. Greg Durand is quite interesting when talking about Isabella and her relationship with Claudio. He references the fact that Isabella plans to join a convent in which nuns are not permitted to see any men, even if family members. Could this decision in some way reflect upon the poor quality of Isabella's family relationships? Indeed, if she were so close to Claudio, Would she really be on the point of making a decision which will result in her never seeing him ever again? Durand's angle also sheds some light upon Isabella's strangely excessive tirades. Does it partly stem from simmering past sibling tensions, as well as natural sensitivity about her chastity?
But I wonder what would happen if you have less of a relationship, if you have maybe not really even been close since you were 8, 9, 10, and what you later say about him, what's sort of revealed in what you say about him, is perhaps underlying what you actually think of his rather libertine behaviour.
Yes.
And maybe from your point of view, from Claudio's point of view, you've just lost a kind of vocabulary of conversation between you, and you haven't had that for a long time. So so the conversation's more stilted. You're more suspicious of each other and your agendas, maybe. I wonder whether that would be something interesting to play.
In this production, Isabella seems a little strange. Lucio seems a cad. Entering to find that Pompey has been arrested, he tries to sneak away before being seen. He favours extravagant gestures with his golf club. Here he takes an enormous swing to illustrate the absent Duke's feeling for the sport, implicitly the sport of sex rather than golf. And in an intriguing change, he exits the scene extremely hastily when Kate Keepdown appears with his baby in a pram and starts to run after him. Note that Kate Keepdown doesn't actually appear in the original text. She is only mentioned once by Mistress Overdone, who explains to Aeschylus, as she has been arrested for being aboard, that Lucio informed against her, and yet he himself fathered an illegitimate child with one of her prostitutes, Kate Keepdown. But as you can see in this production, Kate Keepdown does appear and even repeats one of Mistress Overdone's phrases. Moreover, her baby is also present, and there is another intriguing moment when the Duke has a few perplexing moments peering, trying to soothe the baby, until Kate returns abruptly to wheel the pram off stage. So what of these changes to the production? Well, just as the flashbacks to Mariana and Angelo as a couple in the 2006 Kumar film emphasise the humanity of the Duke's seemingly out-of-the-blue, slightly bizarre plan, here the presence of Kate Keepdown will make his treatment of Lucio in Act 5 seem less spiteful. Yes, in Act 5, the Duke suggests that slandering a prince deserves the more severe punishment, but audiences in this production are also likely to recall his presence when the effects of Lucio's debauchery were explicitly shown here in Act 3 rather than just talked about. The audience will remember that the Duke was on stage when a mother entered with a crying baby, and they will recall that Lucio simply ran off rather than take any responsibility. His sentence, therefore, that Lucio should marry Kate Keepdown seems all the more reasonable in this production, even if Kate Keepdown's clothing very much confirms her position as a prostitute. Much of human life is about deception. Do you agree? Here's my response, which references the RSC production. An initial response to this question is likely to veer towards agreeing with this statement. For instance, the Duke deceives everyone about his identity for the majority of the play, and also instigates a fiendishly complicated plan in which Angelo will be deceived. Angelo has clearly deceived everyone, including himself, about his own potential for sensuality, and there is even an argument that this point could be applied to Isabella. Her references to keen whips and stripping herself to death seem to point at repressed desires. In Act 3, Scene 2, Pompey clearly feels that Lucio has deceived him in relation to their friendship. Following his arrest, he spies comfort and cries bail as his friend enters the stage. However, Lucio responds with mocking references to Caesar and bombards his former ally with a series of breathless rhetorical questions totally devoid of any sympathy or care. And in the RSC 2019 production, Lucio's disinterest in his friend is shown in him trying to sneak off stage the very second he spots him in chains. So there is clearly plenty of deception within the play. But this is not quite the same as saying that much of the human life within the play is about deception. Such a statement would seem to imply that within everyday human interactions, deception frequently takes place, that the characters view deception as an essential tool to be employed on a daily basis. This is clearly not the case for characters such as Claudio, Isabella, Angelo, Aeschylus, and Elbow. The reason Claudio has been arrested is precisely because he has not practiced any deception in relation to his relationship with Juliet, whilst Isabella only ever wanted a simple life with strict restraint. Meanwhile, Angelo may have been deceived about his own human potential for sexual urges, but until becoming enthralled by Isabella, was universally thought of as a straightforwardly simple, unwavering pedant when it came to the law.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, taking you through 4 different interpretations of Measure for